So now that we've got a bunch of waves created, we're going to want to create the system that will manage these waves. So we're going to go into our scripts folder, and we're going to need to create a game manager script. So we'll go to create C# script game manager, which will obviously manage how our game is running at any particular time. We're going to add this to an object in our hierarchy here. So we're going to create an empty object that we'll call game manager. It doesn't really matter where that is in the world, but what we also want to do as a child of this, we're going to create a point in space where our waves will start to appear at. So we're going to create a wave spawn point, and I'm going to move it so it's just off the screen over here, so that way when our waves are being brought into the game, they'll appear off screen and then start coming towards the player. So I'll put Ashley a little bit closer to the screen like that. So they'll start appearing and flying in and trying to do some damage to our player. So that's perfectly fine. The next thing we want to do then is go into our actual game manager script and start creating some code that we can use. So we'll go in here, wait for it to load, there we go. So we created that spawn point, so let's make sure that we remember to use that. So we'll say a public transform wave spawn point. So that's going to be the point in space where our waves get loaded into. Oh, that should be transform. And the next thing we want to do is know what waves we want to bring into the game. Now, if we want to bring in a whole bunch of waves, we don't really want to have to create a bunch of references to individual wave game objects. So we don't want to have, for example, public game object wave 1, public game object wave 2, etc, etc. We don't want to go through doing all that. So instead what we're going to use is a thing called an array. An array is basically a big long list of, in our case we'll use it for game objects, so it's basically a big long list of game objects that you can move through that array and say which game object you want to take from that list. So just as an example, I'm going to say public game object, and we're going to make it an array by putting 2 square brackets just after it. So that means it's a game object array, and we're going to call it waves like that, and then we're going to save and pop back into Unity. And when we're in here, we're going to go to our game manager and give it the game manager script, obviously. So where's that? Pop it there. So now we'll see, okay, we have the reference for our wave spawn point. We might as well fill that in while we're here. And then we have this little drop down here for waves. And at the moment, all it says is size 0. And that's because we haven't added anything into this array at all. So let's go into our waves prefab folder, into our level 1. I just created another another wave of random asteroids here, but let's go and grab wave 1 and drop that into our array. And we don't drop it in where it says size here, we drop it on top of where it says the word waves, because that's the name of our array and that is whatever our array is. And if we drop it into place, we see we get element 0, and that's our first game object in the array. So let's go and add another one. So we'll drop that on top of waves. Now we have a second object and a third. So an important thing to remember about arrays in general is that the first object in the array is referred to as element 0, and it's due to the way how computers recognize stuff. Anything in first place will always be 0, and it counts up from there. So it starts at 0 rather than starting at 1. So our first position in the array is element 0, then the second place is element 1, third place is element 2. So it's just an important thing to keep in your head when you're referring to arrays, is that it's not starting at 1, it's starting at 0. So here we have the example of our game objects all lined up here. The next thing we want to do is have a number value which will count down how long we wait between each wave before we load the next one, and also how long we wait before we load the first wave. So to do that, we're going to go back into our script, and this time we're going to create a public float array that we'll call wave delays, and that'll be what we use to count down how much time we have left until the next wave. We also want to know if at this point in time we want to actually be loading waves into our game. So we're going to use a public bool for that. So we'll say public bool spawning waves. And the reason we'll do that is, say we might want our player to destroy all the waves, and then once it gets to that point where it's destroyed all the waves, we'll stop bringing in any more, and we might want our player to be able to fly on a little bit further, or maybe have a bit of a countdown to the end of the level or something like that. So that's why we want to make sure that once we get to the end of our waves, we stop spawning any more of them. And then finally, what we want to also have is a private int that we're going to call wave tracker. I'm going to use this to keep track of what wave we're currently on. So say when we're on wave 0, what we'll do is count down our waves delay on our float array. So it'd probably be easier if we just can visually see this. So I'm just going to save that, and we'll pop back into our game manager here in Unity. Wait for it to compile, and once it does, there we go. So we've got our wave delays here. At the moment that's empty, but we want to make sure that this is the same length as how many wave objects we have. So I'm going to set this to be size 3 and say we're going to wait 5 seconds for the first array. We'll wait maybe 3 seconds for the second one, and we'll wait another 5 seconds for the third one to pop in. So back in here, the way the logic of this will work is we'll wait 5 seconds, then we'll load this first object in the array, and the way we'll know that which position in the array we should be at is using our wave tracker. So by default it'll start out at 0, so we'll start counting down element 0 here in our wave delay, and once that gets below 0, then we'll go okay, load our game object at position 0 as well, and then we'll make wave tracker move on to being 1. So then we'll go to here and we'll go okay, start counting down this wave delay, and if that gets below 0, then hey, move on to the next object in our array, and then start counting down again, and so on until we reach the very end of our array. So let's take a look at what code we can do to actually start doing that. So first of all, we need to know if we're allowed to spawn waves at the moment. So that's the first check we'll do. We'll say if spawning waves. So if spawning waves is true, then that means we're allowed to start cycling through this whole array of things. And what we'll do then is we'll basically start counting down our wave delays array here. So we'll say wave delays, which is the name of our array up here, and what we want to do is count it down at whatever position we're currently at, and the way we're tracking that position is using our wave tracker. So we'll say wave delays, I spelled that wrong as dealies, but wave delays, and then we put inside a square bracket, we'll type wave tracker. So to start off with, our wave tracker will be 0. So it'll look in the wave delays array, and it'll look at position 0 in the array, and it'll go over here and find, okay, that's 5. So if that's 5, we can start counting that down. So we'll say minus equals time dot delta time. So we're counting down our value in the array, and then the next thing we do is check, okay, we've been counting that down, let's find out if the position we're at in our wave delay, so our wave delays bracket wave tracker, is that now less than 0? Because if it is, what we should do is spawn the next object in the array. So in our case that'll be at position 0 in our waves array. We'll go okay, bring in that first wave, we'll say instantiate our wave. So we go into our waves array and we go to it at position 0, and we know that that's tracked by our wave tracker. So that'll be waves position 0, load that object in. Where do we want to put it? We want to put it at our wave spawn point. So wave spawn point dot position and wave spawn point dot rotation, like that. Okay, so we've got our object being popped into the world now. So while that's popped in, we need to move on to the next element in the array and say wave delays, wave tracker plus equals 1. So that's how we add 1 onto our wave tracker. Now, what we could also use is another bit of kind of short code within Unity, is rather than saying wave tracker plus equals 1, we can just say wave tracker plus plus. And what that does is it's a short way of writing just add 1 to the number. So it'll just add on 1 and our wave tracker will move up to the next bit. And so then in that case, what will happen is, so we'll get to the end of this array here. We'll go back up here and it'll start counting down the next value. So it'll go to element 1 and it'll go, okay, start counting down the value 3, and it'll count that down as it goes, and it'll go, and then once it gets below 0, it'll load up our object at position 1. So it'll load wave 2, and then it'll add 1 on and it'll go to wave 3, and that'll be absolutely fine. It'll start counting down again, it'll get to 0, it'll load up the wave 3 object that we have here, and then it'll update wave tracker again. But now we're going to cause a bit of an error. We're going to have a situation where our wave delays now will be looking to count down a value at position 3 in our wave delay, but there is no element 3. There's only element 2. So that's no good. So what we want to do instead is say we've added on our wave tracker here. We're going to make sure and check that our wave tracker isn't gone any further than what our wave's delays should be. So we'll say here, if our wave tracker, oh, that should be a bracket back here. If our wave tracker is greater than our wave delays array dot length. So our dot length will basically give us how long that should, I don't know why that's gone red. If our wave tracker is greater than or equal to, actually, is what we should use. I don't know why that fixed it. That shouldn't have been an error. I think it was just being a holdover, an error of an error. But what we actually want to do is check that this is greater than or equal to. Because what our wave delays dot length will tell us is the size of the array. So at the moment, our size is 3. And what we're saying is, okay, if our wave tracker gets to be 3, then that's too far. So if it goes looking for element 3 here, we're going to get an error. So what we're going to do instead is say, okay, check and see if our wave tracker is equal to our wave delays length, which is 3. And just in case it somehow gets any higher than that, we want to say also check if it's greater than or equal to our wave delays dot length. So then if it is equal to that, then we can say, okay, we don't want to be spawning any more waves. Instead, what we're going to do is set our spawning waves to be equal to false. So it'll stop trying to loop through this whole system, and it won't give us any errors in our game. So let's save this and see this all in action now. We'll go back into our game, let it compile down the bottom. Once it's finished compiling, there we go. Everything should be hooked up the way we want it to be. We want to make sure that we are actually spawning waves as soon as we start the game. And now we can press play. And we should get our waves of our enemies starting to come into the game. So you see it counting down. And there we go. There's the first group of enemies coming in. Okay, I got destroyed. That's okay. That doesn't matter too much. But we see our second wave comes in. And then finally our third wave now should come in. I don't know why it didn't. Oh, they don't have any movement speed. That's why. That's what happens when you just quickly set up a wave. But you can see they did actually spawn in. And you can see as well that we stopped spawning waves then, and we didn't get any errors. So we know that our wave system is now working perfectly and working the exact way that we want it to.